The runway was already awake long before the sun rose. A thin layer of fog hovered low over the tarmac, moving slowly, almost carefully, as if it knew it didn't belong there for long. Ground lights cut soft amber lines through the mist. Everything about the morning followed a familiar rhythm, predictable, rehearsed, safe. Planes were meant to arrive, refuel, depart. Crews were meant to show up, complete checklists, and leave the ground behind them. That was the promise of an airport. Movement, certainty, continuity. But this flight never left the ground. On paper, it was an ordinary departure, a domestic route, routine cargo, nothing sensitive, nothing historic. The kind of flight that would later be remembered only as a line in a logbook, if it were remembered at all. 2 pilots were assigned. Both were cleared. Both were expected in the cockpit before dawn. And yet, as the minutes passed, something subtle began to fracture. The aircraft sat alone at the gate, sealed and silent. No passengers had boarded yet. No announcements were delayed. There was no panic, no alarms, no sudden rush of security personnel flooding the terminal. Instead, there was a pause so small it barely registered. 5 minutes, then 10. Time moved, but the pilots did not appear. At first, it felt inconsequential. Pilots ran late sometimes. Elevators stalled. Coffee spilled. A quick call, a minor delay, and the day would move on. Airports were built to absorb small disruptions without anyone noticing. That was part of their design. Smooth over uncertainty, keep people calm, keep everything flowing forward. But this delay did not resolve itself. Gate agents checked their paperwork again. Maintenance logs were reviewed. Someone glanced down the jet bridge, expecting to see 2 uniformed figures walking briskly, eyes already focused elsewhere. No one came. The cockpit remained empty. The plane remained grounded, engines cold, as if it were waiting for something that would never arrive. What makes this disappearance unsettling is not what happened next, but what didn't. There was no moment where the story clearly broke. No dramatic realization. No single person who stood up and said, "Something is wrong." Instead, the truth crept in slowly, almost politely. A phone call unanswered. A radio silent. A supervisor frowning at a clock that suddenly felt louder than usual. Airports are places of surveillance. Cameras watch every corridor. Doors record every opening. Badges log every movement. Even in 1987, long before digital saturation, airports were already fortresses of documentation. That is what makes the next fact so deeply disturbing. There was no clear record of the pilots ever reaching the aircraft that morning or leaving the airport. They were simply gone. Not late, not missing in transit. Gone in a way that felt incompatible with the environment itself. It was as if the airport, a machine designed to track human movement with obsessive precision, had briefly looked away. By mid-morning, the flight was officially canceled. Paperwork was filed. Schedules were adjusted. The runway accepted other aircraft without protest. To the outside world, nothing unusual had occurred. Flights were delayed every day. Crews were replaced. Systems adapted. But behind the scenes, questions began to surface. Quiet ones, asked in hushed voices, often followed by long silences. Where would 2 pilots go before takeoff? They hadn't checked in at the gate. They hadn't boarded the plane. They hadn't clocked out. Their cars remained in the employee parking lot. Their personal belongings, wallets, identification, flight bags were unaccounted for. It was as if the last definitive fact about them existed only in the future tense. They were supposed to be there. In the days that followed, language became carefully chosen. Officials avoided the word disappearance at first. They spoke instead of unavailability and failure to report. It sounded less alarming that way, less permanent. But families felt the shift immediately. When certainty disappears, fear rushes in to fill the space. What made the situation even more unsettling was the absence of chaos. There was no lockdown terminal, no mass search of the airfield, no media frenzy in the first hours. The airport continued operating, and in doing so, it quietly normalized the impossible. Somewhere inside that massive structure, beneath the glass terminals and fluorescent hallways, Two men had vanished without triggering the very systems designed to prevent such a thing. That contradiction became the heartbeat of the mystery. Years later, people would look back at that morning and say the signs were there. A door logged open for too long. A maintenance request filed and then inexplicably withdrawn. A security camera that should have recorded something, anything, but didn't. At the time, each detail seemed too small to matter. Together, they formed a shape no one wanted to name. The plane itself would eventually fly again. Aircraft always do. Metal doesn't remember. Runways don't mourn. But those who were there that morning would recall a feeling they couldn't quite explain, a sense that something had slipped through the cracks, something that was never meant to. This was not a story that began with violence or panic. It began with stillness, with a jet that never left the ground, with two empty seats in a cockpit that waited longer than it should have, and with an airport that, for reasons no one could yet understand, kept its secrets locked away. The disappearance did not announce itself. It settled in quietly, embedding itself into records, memories, and unanswered questions. And for decades, it would remain there, unresolved, unspoken, and hauntingly present, like a shadow cast by something that should have been impossible. Before they became a mystery, before their names were reduced to case files and unanswered questions, they were simply men who lived ordinary lives shaped by routine. That ordinariness would later become one of the most haunting aspects of their disappearance. Not because it did something sinister, but because it offered no warning at all. The first pilot had built his life around precision. Friends described him as methodical, the kind of person who arrived early not out of anxiety, but out of respect for process. He trusted systems. Checklists mattered to him. He believed that if he followed the rules closely enough, the world would remain predictable. His uniforms were always pressed. His logbooks were immaculate. Even his handwriting carried a quiet discipline. Letters evenly spaced, margins respected. At home, his life followed a similar rhythm. Mornings began before sunrise. Coffee measured carefully. News read in silence. He rarely spoke about his job, not because he was secretive, but because flying had become so normal it felt almost private. His family knew him as steady, dependable, almost immovable. He was the one people called when something needed to be handled calmly. The second pilot was different, though no less grounded. Where the first leaned into structure, the second relied on intuition. He had a way of reading situations, of sensing when something felt off long before others noticed. Colleagues said he was the kind of pilot you wanted beside you when weather turned unpredictable. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, people paid attention. Outside the cockpit, his life was quieter, less defined by routine. He kept odd hours even when he wasn't flying. He took long drives without a destination. He wrote letters instead of making phone calls. There was a restlessness in him, but not the kind that suggested dissatisfaction. It felt more like curiosity, a desire to understand the world beyond schedules and airspace charts. What connected them was not friendship, at least not in the conventional sense. They weren't known to spend time together outside of work. They didn't share families or hobbies. Their connection was professional, forged in the narrow, shared space of a cockpit where trust was not optional. When you flew together, you learned each other quickly. You learned how the other reacted under pressure, how they made decisions when time compressed. Neither man had shown signs of wanting to disappear. Their financial records were stable. No unexplained withdrawals. No debt spirals. No insurance changes made in secret. Their families recalled no sudden shift in behavior. No cryptic conversations. No goodbyes disguised as ordinary moments. The night before the flight passed without drama. Dinner was eaten. Conversations were unfinished. Plans were made for days that would never arrive. In the weeks following their disappearance, investigators would search for meaning in hindsight. They combed through old conversations, trying to find foreshadowing where none existed. A passing comment about workplace frustration. A moment of fatigue after a long schedule. Normal human experiences stretched thin, examined under a harsh light until they almost looked suspicious. But nothing held. There were no affairs uncovered. No hidden second lives. No radical beliefs. No ties to extremist groups or criminal organizations. These were men embedded deeply in ordinary existence, mortgages, routines, quiet dreams that never needed explanation. That normalcy made the theories that followed feel cruel. When officials first suggested the possibility of voluntary disappearance, families recoiled. The idea that these men would abandon everything without leaving a trace felt less like an explanation and more like an accusation. It required rewriting who they were, turning stability into deception. It ignored the weight of the lives they were rooted in. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. There was no psychological runway leading toward disappearance. Colleagues described the pilots as reliable to a fault. They showed up. They followed procedure. They trusted the environment they worked in. Airports, after all, were places built on control. Every movement was regulated. Every deviation accounted for. To vanish from such a space required either deliberate intent or a failure so profound it challenged the very idea of safety. As days turned into weeks, memories of the pilots began to shift. People spoke about them more carefully, as if afraid that remembering them too clearly might somehow expose how fragile certainty really was. Their faces appeared on bulletin boards, then in newspapers, then in the background of conversations that slowly moved on. Yet for those closest to them, time did not move forward. It circled. Personal items became relics. Jackets left on chairs. Books with bookmarks never moved again. The absence settled into homes like a quiet presence, impossible to ignore. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries arrived without celebration. Children grew older with questions no one could answer. The pilots had lived lives that suggested continuity, tomorrow following the day in an unbroken line. Their disappearance shattered that illusion, revealing how even the most structured existence could be interrupted without warning. In trying to understand how they vanished, people would later search for complexity, for hidden motives or secret struggles. But the most disturbing truth was that there may have been none. These were not men on the edge. They were not unraveling. They were not preparing to disappear. They were simply supposed to be at work that morning. And somehow, in a place designed to prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty, their ordinary lives became the foundation of an extraordinary mystery, one that would endure precisely because it offered no easy explanation, no comforting narrative, and no reason at all. To understand how two men could vanish without leaving a trace, you first have to understand the place that was supposed to make that impossible. Airports are not just transit hubs. They are systems of observation. Every hallway, every door, every badge swipe exists for one reason: to know who is where and when. By 1987, this particular airport had already earned a reputation for efficiency and control. It was a point of pride. Nothing moved without being recorded somewhere. Security cameras watched the main terminals, the gates, the baggage areas. Access points were layered, each one narrow in who could pass through and under what conditions. Employees didn't simply walk where they pleased. They checked in, scanned badges, logged hours. The architecture itself guided behavior, funneling people into predictable paths. The airport was designed to remove uncertainty, to turn human movement into data. And yet, like all systems built by people, it had seams. Most travelers never saw beyond the polished surfaces, the glass walls, the bright signage, the orderly lines. But beneath and behind those spaces existed another world, one rarely acknowledged. Maintenance corridors ran parallel to public hallways, hidden behind unmarked doors. Stairwells connected levels not shown on public maps. Storage rooms held equipment long past its usefulness. Entire sections of the airport had been built decades earlier, then partially abandoned as newer expansions took precedence. These spaces were not secret in the dramatic sense. They were simply forgotten. Employees knew of them in fragments. A shortcut here, a locked door there, a basement hallway used once during training and never again. Over time, these places faded into institutional memory, becoming less like locations and more like rumors. In 1987, surveillance technology was advanced enough to inspire confidence, but limited enough to create blind spots. Cameras recorded on tapes that had to be changed manually. Angles were fixed. Coverage favored public areas over internal infrastructure. If something happened outside the expected flow of movement, it could easily slip between frames. Investigators would later discover that several cameras covering employee-only corridors were either malfunctioning that morning or undergoing maintenance. At the time, this did not raise alarms. Equipment failures were routine. Reports were filed. Repairs were scheduled. The system assumed redundancy would compensate, but redundancy only works when someone is looking. Badge access logs told part of the story, but not all of it. Some doors were designed to remain unlocked during specific hours. Others could be opened from one side without logging entry. Emergency exits, maintenance access points, and utility corridors operated under different rules, created for efficiency rather than security. These design choices were not flaws so much as compromises, decisions made when the airport was smaller, quieter, less scrutinized. The more investigators examined the infrastructure, the clearer it became that the airport was not a single controlled environment, but many overlapping ones. Public space, employee space, restricted space, and then the in-between, the places that existed outside normal oversight because they were rarely used. This realization shifted the nature of the mystery. It was no longer just about two missing men. It was about how institutions create the illusion of total control while quietly accepting gaps as unavoidable. The airport watched almost everything, but not everything mattered equally. Former employees would later describe a strange sense of familiarity mixed with unease when walking through those back corridors. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The air smelled different, older, heavier. Signs were outdated or missing entirely. It felt like being inside a place that time had forgotten, even as the rest of the airport rushed forward. These were not places people lingered. You passed through them quickly, eyes forward, aware that you weren't meant to be there long. And because they were rarely used, no one noticed when they were used at all. The question investigators struggled with was not whether such spaces existed. It was whether anyone could disappear into them unnoticed. Officially, the answer was no. Unofficially, no one could say for sure. Airport officials were reluctant to dwell on these possibilities. Acknowledging them meant acknowledging vulnerability. The airport's reputation depended on the perception of safety, not just from accidents, but from uncertainty. To suggest that someone could vanish within its walls threatened that image. So attention was redirected. Focus stayed on the pilots themselves, their choices, their psychology. The building, ISIN, the system, the structure that surrounded them, remained largely unexamined. But slowly, quietly, another truth emerged. The airport did not see people. It saw patterns. And when someone moved outside those patterns, the system struggled to notice. This was not a failure of technology alone. It was a failure of assumption. The airport assumed that employees would behave as expected, follow designated routes, adhere to schedules. It assumed that any deviation would be brief, explainable, and ultimately harmless. That morning, those assumptions may have been wrong. Somewhere between the public terminal and the cockpit, between the visible and the overlooked, existed a narrow band of space where oversight thinned, a place where movement could occur without immediate consequence, a place that did not feel dangerous because it was not meant to be. And if two men had stepped into that space, even briefly, the airport might not have noticed at all. By the time questions were asked, by the time someone thought to look beyond the obvious, hours had passed. Then days. Then years. The airport continued to function, its systems humming, its lights glowing, its runways accepting departures and arrivals without pause. But beneath that rhythm lay a quiet contradiction. A place built to watch everything had, at least once, failed to see. The trouble with that morning was not that it was chaotic, but that it was too calm. Nothing about it demanded attention. It unfolded the way thousands of mornings before had, each moment sliding neatly into the next. And because of that, the first signs that something was wrong arrived quietly, almost invisibly hidden inside routine. According to the schedule, both pilots were expected to arrive at the airport well before dawn. Their names appeared on the duty roster. Their assignments were confirmed. The flight plan had been filed the night before and approved without issue. In theory, the day had already begun hours earlier, reduced to paperwork and preparation. Time cards showed activity consistent with a normal shift. At least one of the pilots had clocked in. The exact time would later become a point of debate. records conflicted, and some entries appeared to have been overwritten. Still, the assumption at the time was simple. They were somewhere inside the airport, moving through their usual pre-flight routine. A maintenance technician later recalled seeing two figures in uniform walking through an employee corridor, though he couldn't be certain of time. He had been focused on his own task, pushing a cart loaded with tools. The encounter lasted seconds. When asked later, he admitted that he hadn't really seen them so much as register their presence. At an airport, uniforms blur together. Familiarity dulls attention. In the crew lounge, a coffee machine had been used that morning. 2 cups were found in the sink, rinsed but not washed. No one could say who had used them. In isolation, the detail meant nothing. But in hindsight, it became one of those small artifacts that seemed to whisper rather than speak. Radio communication logs told a similar story. There was no distress call, no check-in, no unexpected transmission. The cockpit voice recorder, of course, offered nothing. There had been no flight to record. Silence dominated the record, stretching unbroken across the hours when voices should have been present. At the gate, the aircraft waited. Ground crew completed their tasks as scheduled. Fueling was delayed slightly, then placed on hold. Catering was never loaded. No passengers were called forward. The plane sat in a state of suspended readiness, neither active nor abandoned. To anyone passing by, it looked normal, just another aircraft awaiting clearance. The first real question surfaced not because something dramatic occurred, but because something failed to resolve itself. A supervisor checked the time and frowned. A phone call was placed at the crew lounge. No answer. Another call followed. Then another. Each unanswered ring stretched the silence a little further. Security logs would later show a door open in a restricted corridor around the same time the pilots were expected to move toward the gate. The door remained open longer than usual, long enough to be noted, but not long enough to trigger an alert. It was logged, archived, and forgotten. What no one could determine was whether that door had anything to do with the pilots at all. As minutes turned into an hour, the language around the delay began to shift. Running late became unreachable. The distinction mattered. Late implied intention. Unreachable implied something else. Still, there was no urgency. Airports handle missing crew members with efficiency, not alarm. Replacement pilots could be called. Flights could be reassigned. Systems adapted. That adaptability, usually a strength, became a liability. By the time airport security was formally notified, the window for clarity had already narrowed. People were asked what they had seen. Most couldn't remember anything specific. The morning had blended into every other morning they'd worked. Memory, like surveillance, relied on expectation, and nothing had broken expectation at the time. A janitor recalled hearing voices near a service elevator, then silence. He couldn't say what time it was. He couldn't say who the voices belonged to. He only remembered that the elevator door closed, and that when it opened again later, no one stepped out. His account was noted, then quietly deprioritized. It was too vague, too human. The deeper investigators dug into the timeline, the more it fragmented. No single moment stood out as the point of disappearance. Instead, there were gaps, small, unremarkable stretches of time where the pilots simply did not appear in any record. 5 minutes where no camera footage existed. 10 minutes where no badge swipes were logged. These gaps were not anomalies on their own. Together, they formed a corridor of uncertainty. The most unsettling aspect was how quickly the morning absorbed the loss. By midday, the flight was no longer the focus. Other delays demanded attention. Other problems required solutions. The airport's priority was continuity, not resolution. Somewhere between a canceled departure and an adjusted schedule, 2 men ceased to be accounted for. Later, when the case was revisited, investigators would try to pin the disappearance to a specific moment, a last sighting, a final action. But the truth resisted precision. The pilots did not vanish in a single instant. They faded out of the record gradually, slipping between systems that assumed they would reappear. That morning did not announce itself as the beginning of a mystery. It behaved like every other morning, confident in its routines, comfortable in its predictability. And by the time anyone realized that predictability had failed, the trail had already gone cold. What remained was not a clear sequence of events, but a pattern of absence, one that would haunt every attempt to understand what happened next. When the disappearance finally demanded attention, it did so in a restrained, almost bureaucratic way. There were no sirens echoing to the terminal, no urgent broadcasts over loudspeakers. Instead, the response unfolded behind closed doors, shaped by protocol and quiet calculation. The airport did not treat the situation as a crisis. It treated it as an anomaly, something to be explained quickly, neatly, and without disruption. Local authorities were notified later than families expected. By then, hours had already passed. In the early briefings, language was carefully controlled. Officials spoke of missing personnel rather than missing persons. The distinction softened the implications. It framed the problem as administrative rather than existential. Search efforts began, but they were limited in scope. Public areas were checked first. Lounges, restrooms, offices. Security walked familiar routes, shining flashlights in the corners that rarely held anything more troubling than misplaced equipment. When nothing turned up, the search did not expand immediately. Instead, it paused, waiting, as if the men might still step forward and resolve the situation themselves. Behind this hesitation was an unspoken assumption. People did not simply disappear from airports. Not employees. Not pilots. If they were missing, there had to be a reason that did not implicate the system itself. That assumption shaped every decision that followed. The first theory offered was voluntary absence. Perhaps one pilot had suffered a personal crisis. Perhaps the other had chosen to leave with him. It was framed as concern rather than accusation, but the effect was the same. Attention shifted away from the airport and on to the men themselves. Families were told to remain patient, to consider the stress of profession, to think carefully about whether they had noticed changes in behavior. Grief had barely begun, yet it was already being reframed as explanation. When families pushed back, asking why there was no evidence, no notes, no financial regularities, no witnesses, they were met with vague assurances. Investigations take time. Information would come. In the meantime, speculation filled the void. Some officials floated the idea of an impulsive escape. Others hinted at mental health struggles. None of these suggestions were supported by facts, but they served a purpose. They narrowed the field of inquiry, making deeper scrutiny of airport operations seem unnecessary. As days passed, the initial search quietly scaled back. Media interest remained minimal. Without a crash, without visible danger to the public, the story struggled to gain traction. 2 missing pilots did not fit the narrative of urgency. The airport continued to function, its runways busy, its terminals full. Inside the investigation, cracks began to appear. Records requested by detectives were delayed. Some documents arrived incomplete. Others were summarized rather than shared in full. When inconsistencies were pointed out, conflicting timestamps, missing log entries, explanations were offered quickly and accepted too easily. Clerical errors, technical glitches, human oversight. Each explanation on its own sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern of deflection. A security officer who had initially reported a malfunctioning camera was later asked to revise a statement. He complied. Another employee who believed he had seen the pilots near a restricted corridor was told his memory was likely unreliable. He stopped speaking about it altogether. The first lie did not arrive as a false statement. It arrived as a shift in focus. By the time formal missing persons cases were opened, crucial hours, and perhaps crucial evidence, had already slipped away. The search perimeter remained tight. Certain areas were deemed irrelevant and left unexplored. The possibility that the men were still inside the airport was dismissed as unlikely, then quietly ignored. Families noticed a change before anyone acknowledged it. Phone calls were returned less frequently. Updates became shorter, less specific. Meetings were postponed. The sense of urgency that had never fully materialized now seemed to evaporate entirely. In private, some investigators expressed frustration. They felt constrained, guided toward conclusions rather than discoveries. But speaking openly risked professional consequences. Airports were powerful entities. deeply connected to local economies and national infrastructure. Questioning them too aggressively was not encouraged. The narrative solidified quickly. 2 pilots disappeared. The reason was unknown, but there was no evidence of foul play. Without evidence, there was little more to be done. For the families, this conclusion felt less like an answer and more like abandonment. They began to collect their own information. They compared notes. They requested records repeatedly, only to be told that some materials were restricted or had been misplaced. When they asked about certain sections of the airport, areas mentioned in passing by employees, they were told those spaces were relevant, outdated, or inaccessible. The more they asked, the more resistance they encountered. What made the situation especially painful was the subtle implication that persistence itself was unreasonable, that continuing to ask questions meant refusing to accept reality, that grief, rather than evidence, was driving their doubt. Yet, nothing about the case felt settled. There were too many loose ends, too many things that didn't align, and beneath it all was a growing sense that the investigation had not failed, it had been steered. The first lie was not spoken aloud. It was embedded in the response itself, in the decision to minimize, in the choice to move on, in the quiet understanding that some questions, once asked, threatened more than they promised to answer. And so the case entered its longest phase, not active investigation, but institutional forgetting, a place where mysteries do not end, but slowly disappear from view, much like the men at the center of it all. There was a part of the airport that never appeared on public maps. Even many employees didn't know it existed, at least not in any clear, documented way. It wasn't hidden behind dramatic warning signs or guarded by armed security. Its secrecy came from something far more effective: neglect. The wing had been built decades earlier, during an expansion meant to future-proof the airport. At the time, it housed operations that were considered essential: equipment testing, communications infrastructure, emergency coordination rooms. But airports grow unevenly. New terminals rise. Old plans are abandoned. What was once critical becomes inconvenient, then obsolete. Officially, the wing was closed. That word, closed, suggested finality. A door locked, a space no longer in use. But in reality, the wing existed in a liminal state. It wasn't fully decommissioned. Power still ran through some sections. Ventilation still breathed quietly through ducts. The doors were locked, yes, but keys existed. Badges still opened certain access points, depending on clearance levels that few people understood anymore. When investigators first encountered references to the wing, they were buried in technical documents, maintenance notes, blueprints with annotations that stopped abruptly, internal memos that referenced temporary closures without dates. The language was vague, almost intentionally so. Former employees, when asked, reacted with discomfort. Some claimed they had never heard of it. Others acknowledged it, but dismissed it as irrelevant. A few grew visibly uneasy, their answers trailing off mid-sentence. One retired technician said simply, "We weren't supposed to go down there unless told." Unless told by whom, he couldn't say. The wing was located beyond a series of service corridors, accessible through a door that blended into the wall. No signage, no windows, just a handle and a badge reader that still worked years after it should have been disabled. On the day the pilots disappeared, access logs showed activity near that area, but not enough to raise alarms. One of the most troubling details was how little curiosity the wing inspired at the time. Investigators accepted the explanation that it was obsolete. Obsolete spaces don't matter. The logic went, nothing happens there. But nothing happening is not the same as nothing existing. The wing had been sealed shortly after the disappearance. That fact alone should have raised questions. Officially, the closure was part of routine consolidation. Unofficially, no one could explain why it happened so quickly, or why it required additional security measures. When families asked about it years later, they were told it had nothing to do with the case, that it was a coincidence, that airports close old sections all the time. What they weren't told was how thoroughly the wing had been erased from institutional memory. Blueprints were updated. References disappeared. Employees hired after the closure were never informed it had existed at all. It became a ghost space, present but unacknowledged. Those who had worked near it remembered small details. The way sound changed as you approached, the drop in temperature, the sense that you were stepping outside the rhythm of the airport into something slower, heavier, a place where time felt suspended. One former security officer recalled being instructed to escort someone to the wing shortly after the pilots vanished. He couldn't remember who the person was. He only remembered the order felt unusual, urgent, but quiet. No paperwork, no explanation. When he tried to bring it up later, he was told he must be mistaken. That was a pattern. Any narrative that pointed toward the wing dissolved under scrutiny. Memories were challenged. Documents were reinterpreted. The space itself remained inaccessible, physically and conceptually. To acknowledge it fully meant admitting that there were places inside the airport that no longer answered to oversight, and that possibility was unsettling. Airports are built on trust. Not just public trust, but internal trust. Trust that systems function, that procedures are followed, that nothing exists beyond accountability. A locked wing undermined that trust. It suggested that there were areas where responsibility blurred, where authority overlapped, where actions could occur without immediate consequence. The idea that two pilots might have entered such a space and never left felt unthinkable. And yet, the more investigators avoided the wing, the more it seemed to draw the edges of the mystery toward itself. Years later, a leaked internal memo would surface, referencing containment protocols associated with the wing. The language was technical, stripped of emotion. It spoke of incident mitigation and operational discretion. It did not mention the pilots by name. It did not need to. The memo was dismissed as misinterpreted. Context was cited. The wording was said be standard, but those who read it carefully felt a chill. Containment suggested not repair, not maintenance, but control. The locked wing was not just a physical space. It was a boundary between what the airport was willing to explain and what it was determined to keep buried. Over time, the wing became a symbol for the families. They spoke about it in hushed tones, as if naming it too loudly might close it off forever. It represented the moment the case stopped being about absence and started being about concealment. If the pilots had vanished into thin air, the story would have ended in tragedy. But if they had vanished into a place the airport refused to acknowledge, the story became something else entirely. It became a question of intent. Why lock a wing so thoroughly? Why erase it so completely? Why discourage questions instead of answering them? There were no official explanations that satisfied those who kept asking. Only silence, reinforced by locked doors and missing records. The wing remained closed year after year, renovation after renovation, as if its existence itself posed a risk. And in that silence, the mystery deepened, not because of what was known, but because of what had been deliberately set aside. The airport had not just lost two pilots. It had hidden a place where answers might still be waiting. As the years passed, the absence changed shape. In the beginning, it had been sharp and consuming, a constant ache that made ordinary life feel unreal. Over time, it softened, but it never disappeared. It settled instead into routines, into the quiet corners of homes where answers were supposed to be. For the families, the official story had ended far too quickly. Investigations were closed. Files were archived. The phrase, "no further action," appeared in letters that felt colder than silence. Yet their lives did not move on in the same way institutions did. They lived with questions that followed them from room to room, year after year. What they were never told weighed just as heavily as what they were. In private conversations, officials had assured them that all possibilities had been explored, that no evidence had been overlooked, that if anything significant had existed, it would have come to light. These reassurances sounded complete, but they were built on information the families never had access to. Requests for records were often delayed or denied. When documents were released, they arrived heavily summarized, stripped of context. Names were redacted. Locations were generalized. Details that might have helped reconstruct the truth were treated as unnecessary. The families began to notice patterns. One pilot's spouse received a call years after the disappearance from a former airport employee who spoke carefully, as if every word carried risk. He mentioned areas of the airport that had never been discussed publicly, Places, he said, were off limits, even to some staff. Before he could explain further, the call ended. Follow-up attempts went unanswered. Another family discovered inconsistencies in employment records, shifts logged incorrectly, times altered, entries that didn't align with known routines. When questioned, the discrepancies were attributed to outdated systems, old software, human error. The explanations were always technical, never personal. Grief has a way of sharpening attention. Over time, the families learned to read between lines, to hear what wasn't being said. And what they heard was restraint, not confusion, but caution. Then there were the artifacts. Years after the case had gone cold, a personal item belonging to one of the pilots surfaced in an evidence locker. It had been logged under an unrelated case number, stored without explanation. When the family was notified, the discovery was framed as clerical oversight, a mistake finally corrected. But the question lingered. How had the item gotten there in the first place? It hadn't been found during the initial search. It hadn't been reported missing. It had simply appeared years later, inside a system that claimed there was nothing left to find. For the families, this discovery reopened wounds that had never fully healed. It suggested that evidence had existed all along, evidence that had been misfiled, ignored, or deliberately set aside. It undermined the finality they had been forced to accept. Emotionally, the impact was devastating. Hope returned, but in a distorted form. Not the hopeful anticipation of resolution, but the painful realization that the truth had been close enough to touch and still withheld. They began to speak more openly, connecting with journalists, advocacy groups, anyone willing to listen. In doing so, they encountered resistance that felt disproportionate. Interviews were canceled. Stories were delayed. Sources withdrew. The message was subtle but clear. This was not a story that wanted to be told. Within the families, differences emerged. Some wanted to keep pushing, believing that persistence was the only path left. Others felt exhausted, worn down by decades of unanswered questions. The disappearance had already taken so much. How much more could it take? Children who had once waited for parents who never came home grew into adults with fragments of memory and inherited grief. They asked questions their families could not answer. They searched for records that no longer existed. Their understanding of the disappearance was shaped not by facts, but by the emotional vacuum left behind. One daughter described the feeling as living alongside a shadow. "It's always there," she said. "You don't see it all the time, but it never leaves." What hurt most was not just the loss of the pilots, but the sense that the loss had been managed, controlled, contained, as if the truth itself had been classified as a problem to be solved quietly. When families asked why certain areas of the airport were never searched, they were told those spaces were irrelevant. When they asked why searches ended so quickly, they were told resources were limited. When they asked why new information kept surfacing years later, they were told not to read too much into it. Each answer closed a door rather than opening one. Emotionally, the families lived in a suspended state, unable to grieve fully, unable to hope freely. Closure was offered as a concept, but never delivered as reality. The official narrative asked them to accept uncertainty as final, but uncertainty, when imposed, becomes its own kind of trauma. Over time, the families realized that the truth they were never told might not have been dramatic in the way people expected. It might not involve villains or conspiracies. It might simply involve a chain of decisions made to protect an institution rather than people. That realization was perhaps the hardest to accept. Because if the pilots were lost due to neglect, oversight, or fear of accountability, then their disappearance was not just tragic, it was preventable. And if it was preventable, then silence became a second harm layered on top of first. As decades passed, memories faded outside the families. But within them, the story sharpened. They remembered details others had forgotten, names, dates, small moments that felt insignificant at the time, but grew heavier with age. They carried the weight of knowing that something was missing from the official story, and that whatever it was, it mattered. The truth they were never told did not disappear with time. It waited, quietly, persistently, just like the locked spaces they were never allowed to see. It happened without ceremony, the way long-buried truths often do. not through confession or a breakthrough in the case, but through routine change. Decades after the disappearance, the airport began a major renovation, one of those sweeping projects meant to modernize, streamline, and prepare for the future. Old structures were evaluated. Obsolete areas were flagged. Doors that hadn't been open in years were scheduled to be checked, documented, or removed entirely. The locked wing was on the list. For many of the workers involved, it was the first time they had heard of it. The blueprints they were given showed an outline without detail, a shape that suggested more space than anyone expected. Some assumed it had been a planning error. Others thought it was simply a storage area forgotten over time. When the door was finally opened, it resisted, as if the building itself had grown accustomed to keeping its secrets. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and old machinery. Lights flickered on unevenly, illuminating corridors that had not been walked in years. The space felt preserved rather than abandoned. Equipment left where it had last been used. Chairs pushed in, control panels dark but intact. This was not a ruin. It was a pause. As crews moved deeper into wing, they began to realize that parts of it had remained functional long after the official closure. Power lines had been maintained selectively. Certain systems showed signs of periodic testing. Someone had been here after it was supposedly sealed. That realization changed the tone of the discovery. In one section, a room stood out, not because of what was inside it, but because of how it was secured. The door was reinforced, different from the others. The locking mechanism was more modern, added long after the wing was built. It suggested intention, not neglect. When it was opened, the contents were not immediately identifiable as significant. There were no dramatic scenes, no obvious answers. Instead, there were details that accumulated slowly, their meaning emerging only with context. Personal effects, items that did not belong to space, a flight bag, uniform fragments, objects that carried the unmistakable imprint of daily human use. They were arranged not chaotically, but carefully, as if someone had taken the time to place them where they would not be disturbed. There were also documents, internal reports, maintenance logs, procedural notes. Some were dated after the wing's supposed closure. Others referenced temporary containment and restricted access protocols. The language was clinical, detached, but it pointed toward a reality far removed from the narrative families had been given. The discovery was not immediately made public. Airport officials were notified first, then legal teams, then select authorities. Access to the wing was restricted once again, this time under the justification of safety and investigation. Workers were instructed not to discuss what they had seen. Some complied out of professionalism. Others complied out of fear. When word eventually reached the families, it arrived indirectly, through journalists who had heard rumors of an unusual find during renovations. The initial reports were vague, cautious. A previously inaccessible area had been opened. Materials of interest had been found. For the families, the news landed like a delayed echo. Vindication mixed with dread. The confirmation that something had been hidden came with the realization that the full truth might still be withheld. As investigators re-examined the wing, they faced an uncomfortable reality. Whatever had happened, there was not an accident frozen in time. It had been managed, maintained, preserved just enough to remain contained. There were no remains in the conventional sense, no clear timeline etched into the space. But the evidence suggested that the pilots had entered the wing, and that the wing had not let them leave in the way anyone expected. The absence of violence was, paradoxically, what made the discovery more disturbing. It implied restraint, procedure, decisions made deliberately, not in panic. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Why were personal items separated from public records? Why were documents dated years after closure? Why had the wing been locked with newer systems rather than dismantled? Each question pointed away from randomness and toward intent. Official statements were carefully worded. Authorities acknowledged the discovery, but minimized its significance. They emphasized that investigations were ongoing, that conclusions could not yet be drawn, that speculation would be unhelpful. But the narrative had shifted irrevocably. The locked wing was no longer a rumor or a symbol. It was a physical space with evidence that contradicted decades of reassurance. The disappearance was no longer just an absence. It had a location. Emotionally, the moment felt less like resolution and more like confrontation. The past had been forced into the present, demanding recognition. What had been sealed away had not disappeared. It had waited. For the families, the door opening was both a beginning and an end. It confirmed that their doubts had been justified. It also confirmed that the truth, when it came, would be complicated, incomplete, and deeply unsettling. The wing had not revealed everything, but it had revealed enough to make silence impossible. What emerged from the locked wing did not settle the mystery. It fractured it into something more complex, more unsettling than anyone had prepared for. The expectation, spoken or not, had been that once the door was opened, clarity would follow. Instead, the discovery complicated every assumption that had been built over decades. The evidence suggested presence, not explanation. There were no clear records detailing why the pilots had been in that space, or under whose authority. The documents recovered were procedural rather than descriptive, focused on containment rather than cause. They spoke in the language of systems protecting themselves, terms that avoided assigning blame while still acknowledging risk. This absence of motive was deeply troubling. It meant that whatever happened was not driven by personal conflict or random chance. It was situational, contextual, a response rather than an act. Investigators began to consider a possibility that had been avoided for years. The pilots may not have been victims in the traditional sense. They may have been witnesses. Airports, particularly in the late 1980s, were undergoing rapid technological and operational changes. New systems were being tested. Old infrastructure was being repurposed. Experiments in efficiency and safety sometimes occurred in environments shielded from public oversight. Most of the time, these efforts passed unnoticed. But not all of them. If the pilots had encountered something they were not meant to see, an equipment failure, a procedural violation, a system behaving unpredictably, the response may have prioritized containment over transparency. Not to harm, but to manage, to isolate a problem before it spread. This interpretation unsettled everyone involved. It suggested that the disappearance was not the result of malice, but misplaced confidence, of decisions made quickly within a hierarchy that rewarded silence and compliance. Responsibility became difficult to trace. The airport pointed to external agencies. Agencies pointed to contractors. Contractors referenced outdated protocols. Each layer of explanation diffused accountability further, until it existed everywhere and nowhere at once. There was no single villain to confront, no individual whose actions could be isolated and condemned. The truth, if it existed at all, was embedded in a system that functioned exactly as designed, efficient, compartmentalized, and resistant to scrutiny. Families struggled with this ambiguity. Anger had nowhere to land. Grief had no clear shape. The discovery had confirmed that something had happened, but it refused to explain what or why. Public interest flared briefly, then faltered. Without a dramatic conclusion, the story resisted headlines. Complexity did not translate easily into outrage. Official statements, careful and restrained, framed the findings as historical anomalies rather than present failures. Behind closed doors, however, discussions took on a different tone. Legal considerations dominated. Liability was assessed. Language was debated. How much could be acknowledged without opening the door to consequence? In the end, the truth that emerged was partial by design. Authorities conceded that the pilots had likely entered the locked wing voluntarily, possibly under instruction. They acknowledged that the wing had been in limited use after its supposed closure. They stopped short of explaining what necessitated containment or why the men never returned to public space. The narrative offered was one of tragic coincidence rather than deliberate action, of unfortunate overlap between human presence and institutional blind spots. But coincidence felt insufficient. The emotional impact of this section of the story lies not in revelation, but in restraint. The truth did not explode into the open. It was filtered, shaped, reduced to what could be safely shared. For those seeking closure, this was perhaps the most painful outcome. The discovery had promised answers. What it delivered was context without clarity. The pilots were no longer missing in the abstract. Their disappearance had been anchored to a place and a set of decisions. But the reasons behind those decisions remained obscured, protected by time and bureaucracy. In this version of the truth, no one intended harm, and yet harm occurred. No one broke the system. The system simply operated according to its own priorities. That realization reframed the entire story. It was no longer about an inexplicable vanishing, but about the cost of institutional self-preservation, about how easily people can become secondary to processes, and how quietly that transition can happen. The locked wing had revealed something real, but it also revealed the limits of revelation itself. Some truths, it seemed, were not hidden because they were explosive, but because they were inconvenient. They demanded reflection rather than outrage, accountability rather than spectacle. And those are the hardest truths to hold. The runway is still there. It stretches forward in long, clean lines, illuminated at night by lights that pulse with quiet precision. Aircraft line up, engines humming, waiting for clearance. When permission comes, they move forward without hesitation, accelerating toward a sky that promises distance and arrival. To most people, it is just another runway, functional, anonymous, reliable. Few know what happened beneath its shadow. Decades after the disappearance, the airport looks different. New terminals rise where older ones once stood. Digital screens have replaced paper boards. Security has grown more visible, more automated, more confident in its reach. The language of safety has evolved, polished by time and technology. Yet the ground itself has not changed. Planes still pass over the same concrete, the same buried infrastructure, the same sealed spaces that were never meant to be remembered. There is no plaque for the pilots, no quiet corner where their names are etched into metal or stone. The airport does not mark the absence. It does not pause for reflection. In the official story, the disappearance is a closed chapter, unresolved, yes, but finished. For the families, it never ended. They learned to live with a kind of dual awareness. On the surface, life continued. Jobs changed. Children grew older. Celebrations happened. But beneath it all was a constant knowledge that something essential had been left unfinished. Not just an investigation, but the truth itself. Closure, they were told, was something they needed to find within themselves. It was offered as an emotional solution to a factual problem. Over time, some tried to accept that, others could not. The idea that peace could exist without honesty felt like another form of loss. The reopening of the lock wing had changed everything, and nothing. It confirmed that the disappearance had not been imagined or exaggerated, that there had been more to the story all along. But it also demonstrated the limits of revelation. Even when doors open, institutions decide how far light is allowed to travel. The final statements issued by authorities were careful. They acknowledged past oversights. They expressed regret for the pain caused. They stopped short of accountability. The language was soft, abstract, designed to sound complete without being specific. For the public, the story faded again. News cycles moved on. Attention shifted elsewhere. Without a definitive ending, the mystery resisted becoming legend. It existed in a quieter space, too unresolved to be satisfying, too complex to be easily retold. And yet, something lingered. Former employees, now retired, occasionally spoke in fragments. A sentence here, a memory there, always incomplete, always careful. They talked about a feeling more than an event, a sense that something had gone wrong in a way no one knew how to address. The pilot's name surfaced in online forums, in long threads where strangers tried to reconstruct the timeline, analyze documents, map the airport's forgotten spaces. Each attempt came close to understanding, then stopped short. The truth seemed always just beyond reach, not because it was hidden, but because it refused to be simple. This is where the story rests, not with resolution, but with persistence. Every day, planes take off over the same ground where two men walked into work and never came home. Passengers fasten their seatbelts, trusting systems they will never see. They assume that everything beneath them is known, accounted for, controlled. Most of the time, that assumption holds. But the disappearance remains as proof that control is never absolute. That even in places built on oversight and precision, there are moments when people fall outside the record, when decisions made quietly can echo for decades. The haunting part is not what was discovered, but what was normalized. The idea that unanswered questions can be filed away, that silence can become policy, that time itself can be used as a solution. The runway does not remember, but people do. And as long as memory exists, the story does not end. It waits, unresolved, unsettling, and quietly present, like a shadow cast by something that was never meant to disappear at all. The runway is still there, and that fact alone feels unsettling. It stretches forward in long, disciplined lines, its surface repainted countless times, its cracks sealed, its lights upgraded and recalibrated. At night, it glows with the quiet confidence of modern aviation. Precise, orderly, reassuring. Aircraft taxi across it every hour, carrying people who trust that everything beneath them is known, measured, and secure. Very few of them know that this runway once waited for a plane that never left. Time has done what it always does best. It has layered new meaning over old silence. The airport has expanded outward and upward, transforming itself into something sleeker, faster, and more technologically assured. Glass replaces concrete. Digital systems replace analog ones. Security checkpoints hum with automation. Everything looks cleaner now, more transparent, as if visibility itself has been perfected. But visibility is not the same as truth. There is no marker for the two pilots. No memorial tucked into a quiet hallway. No moment of institutional pause to acknowledge that something went terribly wrong here. Their absence exists only in records that few people ever read, and in memories that grow heavier as those who carry them grow older. For the families, the years have blurred into something both distant and immediate. Grief no longer feels sharp, but it never feels resolved. It has become a constant undercurrent, present even in moments of joy, surfacing unexpectedly in the smallest details. A uniformed pilot passing through a terminal, the sound of engines overhead, a news story about aviation safety that promises certainty. They learned long ago that waiting for official closure was futile. What they wanted was not just an answer, but acknowledgement, an admission that what happened mattered enough to be spoken plainly. Instead, they were offered language designed to soften reality. Regret without responsibility. Oversight without accountability. The reopening of the lock wing had felt, briefly, like a turning point. A door that had been sealed for decades finally opened, and with it came the confirmation that their doubts had been justified. Something had been hidden. Something had been preserved. Something had been kept quiet not because it was unknowable, but because it was inconvenient. And yet, even that moment did not deliver resolution. What followed was a careful narrowing of truth. Information released in fragments. Context withheld. Conclusions framed in ways that protected systems rather than people. The wing had revealed evidence, but not intent. Presence, but not explanation. The story was allowed to exist, just not fully. For the families, that partial truth was almost worse than silence. Silence, at least, was honest in its absence. Partial truth suggested control. It implied that someone, somewhere knew more, and had decided how much was enough. Years later, some family members stopped giving interviews. Not because they had accepted the official narrative, but because repeating the story felt like reopening a wound that never healed properly in the first place. Others continued to speak, driven by a sense that memory itself had become a responsibility. If they stopped talking, the story might disappear entirely. The airport, meanwhile, continued to thrive. Millions passed through its terminals every year. New routes were added. Awards were won. Safety records were celebrated. The disappearance of 2 pilots in 1987 became a footnote, an anomaly buried beneath decades of successful operations. This contrast is what makes the ending so haunting. The airport did not collapse under the weight of what happened. It absorbed it. It adapted. It moved forward. In doing so, it demonstrated something deeply unsettling about institutions. They do not need to resolve the past in order to survive it. The systems worked. Flights departed. Trust was maintained. And because the public never felt endangered, the deeper questions never demanded answers. But safety measured only by outcomes misses something essential. The disappearance was not about a malfunctioning plane or a catastrophic failure visible from the outside. It was about people, trained professionals, who stepped into a system and were lost within it. Not destroyed, not publicly harmed, but quietly removed from the record. That kind of loss does not trigger alarms. It does not force reform. It simply lingers. Former employees sometimes return to the airport as passengers, moving through spaces they once knew intimately. Some avoid certain corridors without knowing why. Others feel a vague unease they cannot explain. They have forgotten details, but not feelings. Those feelings matter. They suggest that beneath the confidence of modern infrastructure lies something fragile. The assumption that everything important will be noticed, that every person will be accounted for, that systems designed to manage complexity will also protect humanity. The story of the two pilots challenges that assumption. It suggests that there are moments when systems prioritize continuity over care, order over inquiry, when decisions made quietly under pressure become permanent not because they are right, but because they are easier to live with. The most unsettling truth is not that the pilots disappeared, but that the world adapted so quickly to their absence. Life went on. Flights were rescheduled. Rosters were filled. Records were archived. The disruption was absorbed, and in that absorption, the disappearance became normalized. Not acceptable, but manageable. That normalization is the real ending of this story. There is no final revelation that ties everything together. No confession that brings clarity. No moment where accountability arrives cleanly and completely. Instead, there is persistence of memory, of doubt, of unanswered questions that refuse to fade entirely. The runway still exists. Planes still lift into the sky from the same ground. Passengers still trust what they cannot see. Most of the time, that trust is deserved. But sometimes it is misplaced. And sometimes the cost of that misplaced trust is carried quietly by families who never received the truth they were owed, and by a place that learned how to survive without ever fully explaining what happened within its walls. The story does not end with closure. It ends with awareness. An understanding that even the most controlled environments contain blind spots, that silence can be engineered as carefully as safety, and that when truth is delayed long enough, it does not disappear. It simply waits, reshaped by time, ready to haunt those who are willing to look closely enough. The runway does not remember, but the question remains, lingering in the space between departure and arrival, between what is known and what is hidden. If two people could vanish here without noise, without warning, without resolution, what else have we learned to accept simply because everything else kept moving forward? As the years passed, the absence changed shape. In the beginning, it had been sharp and consuming, a constant ache that made ordinary life feel unreal. Over time, it softened, but it never disappeared. It settled instead into routines, into the quiet corners of homes where answers were supposed to be. For the families, the official story had ended far too quickly. Investigations were closed. Files were archived. The phrase, "no further action," appeared in letters that felt colder than silence. Yet their lives did not move on in the same way institutions did. They lived with questions that followed them from room to room, year after year. What they were never told weighed just as heavily as what they were. In private conversations, officials had assured them that all possibilities had been explored, that no evidence had been overlooked, that if anything significant had existed, it would have come to light. These reassurances sounded complete, but they were built on information the families never had access to. Requests for records were often delayed or denied. When documents were released, they arrived heavily summarized, stripped of context. Names were redacted. Locations were generalized. Details that might have helped reconstruct the truth were treated as unnecessary. The families began to notice patterns. One pilot's spouse received a call years after the disappearance from a former airport employee who spoke carefully, as if every word carried risk. He mentioned areas of the airport that had never been discussed publicly, places he said were off-limits, even to some staff. Before he could explain further, the call ended. Follow-up attempts went unanswered. Another family discovered inconsistencies in employment records, shifts logged incorrectly, times altered entries that didn't align with known routines. When questioned, the discrepancies were attributed to outdated systems, old software, human error. The explanations were always technical, never personal. Grief has a way of sharpening attention. Over time, the families learned to read between lines, to hear what wasn't being said, and what they heard was restraint, not confusion, but caution. Then there were the artifacts. Years after the case had gone cold, a personal item belonging to one of the pilots surfaced in an evidence locker. It had been logged under an unrelated case number, stored without explanation. When the family was notified, the discovery was framed as clerical oversight, a mistake finally corrected. But the question lingered. How had the item gotten there in the first place? It hadn't been found during the initial search. It hadn't been reported missing. It had simply appeared years later, inside a system that claimed there was nothing left to find. For the families, this discovery reopened wounds that had never fully healed. It suggested that evidence had existed all along, evidence that had been misfiled, ignored, or deliberately set aside. It undermined the finality they had been forced to accept. Emotionally, the impact was devastating. Hope returned, but in a distorted form. Not the hopeful anticipation of resolution, but the painful realization that the truth had been close enough to touch and still withheld. They began to speak more openly, connecting with journalists, advocacy groups, anyone willing to listen. In doing so, they encountered resistance that felt disproportionate. Interviews were canceled. Stories were delayed. Sources withdrew. The message was subtle but clear. This was not a story that wanted to be told. Within the families, differences emerged. Some wanted to keep pushing, believing that persistence was the only path left. Others felt exhausted, worn down by decades of unanswered questions. The disappearance had already taken so much. How much more could it take? Children who had once waited for parents who never came home grew into adults with fragments of memory and inherited grief. They asked questions their families could not answer. They searched for records that no longer existed. Their understanding of the disappearance was shaped not by facts, but by the emotional vacuum left behind. One daughter described the feeling as living alongside a shadow. "It's always there," she said. "You don't see it all the time, but it never leaves." What hurt most was not just the loss of the pilots, but the sense that the loss had been managed, controlled, contained, as if the truth itself had been classified as a problem to be solved quietly. When families asked why certain areas of the airport were never searched, they were told those spaces were irrelevant. When they asked why searches ended so quickly, they were told resources were limited. When they asked why new information kept surfacing years later, they were told not to read too much into it. Each answer closed a door rather than opening one. Emotionally, the families lived in a suspended state, unable to grieve fully, unable to hope freely. Closure was offered as a concept, but never delivered as reality. The official narrative asked them to accept uncertainty as final, but uncertainty, when imposed, becomes its own kind of trauma. Over time, the families realized that the truth they were never told might not have been dramatic in the way people expected. It might not involve villains or conspiracies. It might simply involve a chain of decisions made to protect an institution rather than people. That realization was perhaps the hardest to accept, because if the pilots were lost due to neglect, oversight, or fear of accountability, then their disappearance was not just tragic, it was preventable. And if it was preventable, then silence became a second harm layered on top of the first. As decades passed, memories faded outside the families. But within them, the stories sharpened. They remembered details others had forgotten, names, dates, small moments that felt insignificant at the time, but grew heavier with age. They carried the weight of knowing that something was missing from the official story, and that whatever it was, it mattered. The truth they were never told did not disappear with time. It waited, quietly, persistently, just like the locked spaces they were never allowed to see. "It's always there," she said. "You don't see it all the time, but it never leaves." What hurt most was not just the loss of the pilots, but the sense that the loss had been managed, controlled, contained, as if the truth itself had been classified as a problem to be solved quietly. When families asked why certain areas of the airport were never searched, they were told those spaces were irrelevant. When they asked why searches ended so quickly, they were told resources were limited. When they asked why new information kept surfacing years later, they were told not to read too much into it. Each answer closed a door rather than opening one. Emotionally, the families lived in a suspended state, unable to grieve fully, unable to hope freely. Closure was offered as a concept, but never delivered as reality. The official narrative asked them to accept uncertainty as final, but uncertainty, when imposed, becomes its own kind of trauma. Over time, the families realized that the truth they were never told might not have been dramatic in the way people expected. It might not involve villains or conspiracies. It might simply involve a chain of decisions made to protect an institution rather than people. That realization was perhaps the hardest to accept, because if the pilots were lost due to neglect, oversight, or fear of accountability, then their disappearance was not just tragic, it was preventable. And if it was preventable, then silence became a second harm layered on top of the first. As decades passed, memories faded outside the families. But within them, the story sharpened. They remembered details others had forgotten. Names, dates, small moments that felt insignificant at the time, but grew heavier with age. They carried the weight of knowing that something was missing from the official story, and that whatever it was, it mattered. The truth they were never told did not disappear with time. It waited, quietly, persistently, just like the locked spaces they were never allowed to see.